So we're still getting some fallout from Iran's shooting down of that Ukrainian airliner during their retaliation against the U.S. I guess they called that Operation Martyr Soleimani. And the folks in Iran, quite a few of them, are none too happy with their government for shooting down that plane, and they're apparently not very satisfied with Iran's response to the whole incident. And so after, I believe it was, that the government finally admitted after 3 days that they did in fact shoot down the plane, some new protests erupted, and folks have been calling on the government to be a little more accountable at higher levels than they have been thus far. I guess now they've made a couple of arrests, probably of the guys who were directly responsible, the field commanders or whoever who ordered the attack. But the protesters, and I don't speak Farsi, so I'm having to rely a little bit on news sources that I have some faith in, to tell me that apparently the protesters are more interested in higher level guys. They want some name that they've heard of, some higher military brass maybe, to be held responsible for this. Now, the government seems to be taking a pretty heavy-handed response to these protesters, similar to the response that they had to the last round of protests, which was, it seems like it was only a few weeks ago. It was right before Soleimani got killed. In fact, it was really the last big operation that he led, and it was a big disaster for the government, PR-wise at home, because Soleimani and the Quds Force apparently were put in charge of that crackdown, and I guess they were a little too heavy-handed and enraged. A lot of the protesters, by some accounts, made the protests worse. But from what I've seen, the accounts of what I've seen of Soleimani's response was that he did not handle that very well. But apparently, I guess his successors, although who knows if I don't know if the Quds Force are in charge of this crackdown, but whoever's managing this crackdown seems to be making similar mistakes. Of course, I know I brought this up before, but it's very hard to know whether or not you're being too hard or too soft on protesters when it comes to preserving your government, because many people, as I said when these protests were going on before, looking back at the protests that led to the overthrow of the Shah and the installation of this current regime in Iran, led by the mullahs, people say that the Shah didn't crack down hard enough. Others say he cracked down too much. But either way, I think that there is you can go one way or the other. You can either be soft enough on the protesters to where you don't make things any worse, and you just sort of let the protests peter out and flame out, or you can crack down so hard that you end up scaring people into not protesting, into going back home, and not showing any sort of disdain for the government. But then you have this mushy middle, to where you're so hard that you enrage people more, but you're not hard enough on them to scare them. You just sort of insult them, and you inflame the tensions worse. And that's absolutely the worst thing you can do if you care about preserving your government. But that does seem, at least to me, to be more in line with what Iran's response has been to these last couple of protest movements. Now, I don't think that this will lead to the downfall of the Iranian government or anything like that. I do think that they are a little more stable than your average Middle Eastern tin pot. They do have a bit more depth to their bench, let's say, than some of these other governments. They aren't, some kind of personalist dictatorship. And so even if these protests, which it doesn't look to be at this point, but even if they did lead to the political downfall of the current leadership, there are guys to step in and replace them. It's like in the U.S., if there was some major protest movement against something that the government did, the most that you might see, and this is, would be very hard to believe, but the most that you would see probably would be a resignation of the current U.S. president, and then maybe the vice president stepping in. You wouldn't see a collapse of the entire government. Whereas in, a country like, say, Syria, if there was a protest movement that did successfully overthrow Bashar Assad, you probably would see a collapse of the entire government and something new springing up to replace it. And so I don't think that somehow in Iran we're on the cusp of, the Iranian government being overthrown and replaced by some pro-American type of regime. With that said, however, I don't think that this problem of the airliner being shot down is going to go away anytime soon in domestic Iranian politics, and that's because this really strikes close to home for them, because a major bit of propaganda that the Iranians have been able to recycle over the last 30 years has been the U.S. shooting down an Iranian civilian airliner, and using this, what happened in that case. I believe it was Iran Airlines 655 was the flight. Using that tragedy, where the U.S. accidentally shot down that plane, Iran has been, that was part of Iran's demonization of the U.S. government, and to make their people hate them. But now that they did the same thing, it's blowing back on them. And so what can the government say? Are they going to say, oh, well, it's not that bad, it was an accident? Well, it's the same thing happened with the U.S. So if it's no big deal if the Iranian government does it, then, it's no big deal when the U.S. does it. And therefore, their whole, 30 years of propaganda goes out the window. So it just puts them in an awkward position. But, I mean, let's be honest. If I get that most people don't like to think this way. They like to think that their own government, are the good guys. They want to wave the flag, and for them, it's not the red, white, and blue. I guess it's the red, white, and green. But in reality, all governments are run by thugs. So yes, it was bad that the Iranians shot down this airliner. It was bad when the Americans did it. Neither of them are uniquely evil for having done so. Is it worse than crimes committed by a lot of governments in the world? Sure. Is it worse than anything that any government has ever done? Obviously not. It's only a couple hundred people in each case. Over the course of the 20th century, governments slaughtered millions of people. Of course, most of those were in China. And yet, there's no shortage of Chinese people who are very patriotic and will wave their flag with pride and talk about how wonderful the last, 70 years or so of the Communist Party rule in their country has been. So I guess it is kind of refreshing to see at least some folks in Iran who are, willing to call out their own government's BS. I don't think that any Americans would ever really do that. You didn't see Americans protesting in the streets, furious with our president after the shooting down of the Iranian airliner back in 1988. And hell, our government's done plenty of worse things since then, and nobody's been out in the streets protesting that. I mean, if you do that, well then, hey, aren't you a blame America firster? If you call out the government for committing, terrible atrocities against civilian populations in other countries. I mean, hell, if only the founders could see that in modern America, criticizing the government makes you unpatriotic. It's just, it's sad to see how much of their vision's been destroyed. But yeah, you still have people out there, wearing their tricorn hats and putting on the show and talking about, the Sons of Liberty, and they threw the tea into the harbor, and that great American spirit of rebellion. It's all a bunch of bullshit. 99% of people don't do it. I mean, they have a red coat mentality. And it's not unique here. I'm sure the majority of people in Iran certainly feel that way too. And so I'll keep following these protests. I don't think that they're done yet. I think that there might be something that comes of this. But, we see this every few years, that protests flare up in Iran, and, they usually are crushed, and you don't really see much of consequence come out of them. But I don't expect that these protests will ever stop, though. I think that it's a generational shift happening in Iran. You probably have the younger folks who are a little less socially conservative and aren't so in line with having a theocracy. And so you probably will start seeing a lot of, gradually in that country, things begin to shift. But really, I don't see, without some external help, I don't see a full-on regime change happening anytime soon. But of course, it goes without saying that the CIA, I'm sure, is working with at least some of the folks involved in these current protests, trying to turn it into a regime change putsch. But I doubt that that'll work. So if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.